Welcome back to my Strategy is Performance series. I am Colonel Tino Perez, and I'm a teacher at the U.S. Army War College. And this series on Strategy is Performance is part of the idea that strategy means doing things. In this specific series, we're talking about strategy in terms of normative evaluation, causal literacy, building coalitions, and the canvassing of perspectives, or simply research. In this specific episode, I want to talk about the strategic environment and make 4 points. So the first point is, when we think about the strategic environment, we ought to think of it partly in terms of an obstacle course. That is, in order to achieve the aims or the objectives we wish to realize, we need to think of the landscape, the environment, in terms of an obstacle course, which consists of things in the world that will either hinder the accomplishment of our aims, will create obstacles and impede them, or they will facilitate our being able to accomplish these objectives. So what are the things in the world that we're talking about? Well, some of them might be terrain. Some of them might be, say, organizations. Some of them may be persons. The terrain consists also of weapon systems. It consists of multinational partners. It consists of resources. And it consists of lethal power. So as we think about the environment, what we do is we say we want to accomplish a certain objective, a certain aim, a certain end. And as we act in the world, we need to realize that some things are going to bump us off our track and some things are going to help us. So that's the first the point I want to make, and it'll come to the fore a little bit later on. The next thing we want to do is think of the environment in terms of a landscape that we actually wish to change. So if you think about the environment as a confluence of forces that cause human behavior, one of the things we want to do is to change the landscape through our interventions in order to make it more desirable to, say, our national interests, to our military units' aims, to our coalition's aims, etc. So we need to think, in the first case, about the various obstacles that exist in the world. We can't ignore them. They will get in our way. We have to contend with them. And we also want to think about the landscape in terms of setting up those objectives, those aims, those outcomes that we wish to change in order to make the landscape more desirable or akin to what we want to achieve. Now, the third point I want to emphasize is the priority of the strategic environment. Recently, there's been issued by the U.S. Joint Community Joint Doctrine Note 118, and it's simply entitled Strategy. And one of the quotes in this publication is by Robert J. Art, who says, "The most fundamental task in devising a grand strategy is to determine a nation's national interests." The most fundamental task is devising a grand strategy such as is to determine a nation's national interest. Now, I think this is misguided. I think it's actually wrong, because before we can identify what national interests are, we actually have to lay out, to map out the landscape, to map out the strategic environment. And if you'll notice, what our interests are in meaningful ways, it's, say, the United States' founding as a nation, or during and after the Civil War, or around the time of World War I and World War II, throughout the 50s and the 80s and the 21st century, our interests change in tangible, meaningful ways because the landscape changes. So my argument is that we need to put much more emphasis on the priority of the strategic environment. And this is especially true because culturally, in the military community, our habit of thinking about the environment is in terms of ends, ways, means, and risk. The alignment of ends, ways, and means, and the consideration of risk as we build our strategies. Well, if you notice that formulation does not include an appreciation of the environment as a priority. So I ask you to consider that, and whether it's compelling or not. The last point I want to make is about the strategic environment itself and then how to think about it. If, for those of you who have been in the military, have worn a uniform at the tactical level, those of you who are still wearing a uniform, you can recall this. When we were young, say platoon leaders, company commanders, we used to analyze the tactical, at the tactical level, the terrain and the enemy that we were going to be practicing against. So what we would do, for instance, if told to set up a defense, is we'd be told to look at a map by our commanders, and they would say, hey, the enemy's going to be attacking from north to south, and I do not want you to allow the enemy to cross south of this no penetration line. And then what we would do is, after receiving that order, we'd go to the piece of terrain that was assigned to us, and we would begin with the S2's help, the intelligence officer's help, to map out what the terrain looked like. And so we would say, okay, this is elevation marks, this is high ground here, there's more high ground over here, and maybe perhaps in this terrain, there's a tree line here with a pretty thick forest. And we knew that the enemy that would be attacking would, in this case, be, say, an armored force of some kind. So we'd map out the terrain, and then we would start to see, well, there's an inner visibility line here. And for those of you who are not in the military, an inner visibility line is where the terrain meets the horizon. So if you imagine you're on a highway and you get to a point where the highway runs into the horizon, you can't see the other side, that is what in military terms is called the inner visibility line. And they're very important for us at the tactical level. So there'd be an inner visibility line here where the ground would rise and then fall again, and then maybe one over here. And we would do a reconnaissance to ensure that this is true. Then what we would do is we'd start to say, okay, well, if the enemy's going to attack from north to south, it might use this mobility corridor here to skirt the high ground. It might go this way. It might come this way. And we start to see the possibilities for maneuver for the enemy because we've mapped out the constraints that the terrain presents to us. In the same way, we can also figure out how best to maneuver our forces in the defense. So I could say, well, if that's what the enemy is going to do, what I want to do with my different warfighting functions is to somehow get the enemy, after they've crossed this line, to move in towards the center, away from the high ground. And I decide that I want to center the enemy, force them to move to this target reference point, which is where I want to focus the destruction of the enemy. And then I array my forces in order to be able to do that. If you notice, what we did is we actually took account of the terrain, of the enemy's doctrine and how that enemy might fight. And by identifying those constraints, what comes to the fore, what emerges, are windows of opportunity, opportunities for maneuver. Now, if we had an intelligence officer who was preparing us for this defense, who said, well, sir, one of the things you're going to see is in this defense is you're going to see some terrain. You're going to see some terrain features. You're going to see some enemy. That enemy is probably going to have some guns and maybe some mortars. And there's also going to be weather. It might rain, it might not, it might be dry, it might be cloudy, it might be windy or not. If that's all that the intelligence officer told you, you would probably work to get him fired or her fired, because this doesn't help you, right? What we need to do when we do our work is to configure the terrain, the enemy, the weapon systems, and the weather in such a way that it allows constraints and windows of opportunity to be seen. Now, that's at the tactical level. What do we see at the strategic level when we talk about the strategic environment? There are many commands, including service component commands, combatant commands. We also see the various military services and the intelligence community produce something called a description of the operational or strategic environment. And almost without fail, in fact, I can't think of really any exceptions, what these narratives tell us is that the world is a dangerous and rapidly changing place. So the world consists of dangerous actors, some of them being like North Korea, challenges to the international community, including China, Russia, Iran. There are also terrorists out there. There are also criminal actors. There's also climate change. There's also technological change. And here we get into cyber, artificial intelligence, etc. And what you'll see is almost in every case, the operational environment descriptions, the narratives, will simply list the various threats and challenges that compose the world that we have to navigate as an obstacle course in this step-by-step, point-by-point way. In the same way that the bad S2, the bad intelligence officer, simply listed the things that we would see without configuring them. What I want to end this episode with is by asking you whether it would be worth, when you consider strategic interventions, to first look closely at the environment, to configure the relevant challenges, the relevant constraints in such a way that when you do it, it brings to the fore, like in this example, windows of opportunity because you brought out the constraints. There's a quote I'd like to read, and we'll put it up on the screen. And it comes from Bruno Latour, who is a philosopher. And he writes with respect to science, the closer you are to science, the more possibilities open up. The more intimate your contact with first nature, the more surprises you get, the more unexpected agencies spring up, the more margins for maneuver you obtain. Is this not the experience we all have when reading and writing scientific literature? In science, when necessity comes in, it is possibilities that are multiplied. In our example, when we brought in necessities, what is the terrain doing? What is the enemy going to do? What is the intervisibility line? What's the weather? Where can I array my forces? When necessity comes in, it opens up windows of opportunity. Let's apply that same logic to our thinking about the strategic environment. And instead of merely listing things in the world, let's configure them in a way that yields compelling reasons for action. Thank you very much.